Some people mistake silence for ignorance. They only realize the difference when silence answers back. The laughter was soft enough to escape the attention of every other table, yet sharp enough to linger in the air like the faint scent of expensive cologne. It came from the corner booth beneath the warm glow of a crystal chandelier, where four billionaires in tailored navy suits spoke comfortably in Russian while studying the young waitress arranging fresh water glasses before them. Claire Bennett moved with quiet precision, her white shirt perfectly pressed beneath a simple black apron, her blonde hair tied neatly behind her neck, and the calm expression on her face revealing nothing beyond professional courtesy. She had already worked nearly 9 hours that Friday evening at Ashford House, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, where every polished fork reflected candlelight and every whispered conversation carried the weight of money. Most guests barely noticed the servers unless something went wrong. Claire preferred it that way. Invisible people often heard everything. As she placed the final glass beside the oldest guest, one of the men leaned toward another and switched effortlessly into Russian. His smile widened. The others followed, their voices smooth, confident, amused. They assumed the language wrapped their words inside a wall no waitress could cross. Claire lowered the bottle without changing her expression. She continued filling each crystal glass to exactly the same level, her movements measured and graceful, while every syllable reached her ears with perfect clarity. One man joked that she probably believed Moscow was somewhere near Alaska. Another laughed that expensive restaurants had started hiring models instead of educated staff. A third quietly wondered whether she even knew where Russia was on a map. The oldest billionaire chuckled, lifted his wine glass, and remarked that people wearing aprons usually carried plates, not ideas. Their laughter blended with the soft notes of a piano drifting through the dining room. Claire simply nodded as though they had complimented the weather. Across the room, Ethan Calloway looked up from his phone. He had been reviewing numbers from an acquisition scheduled for Monday, but the laughter pulled his attention toward the neighboring table. Ethan recognized every man sitting there. Powerful investors, brilliant negotiators, men who built fortunes predicting markets before everyone else. Yet something about the expressions on their faces reminded him of college students sharing a joke they assumed no professor could understand. He watched Claire for only a second before returning to the financial report glowing on his screen. She seemed completely unaffected, or perhaps she was simply good at hiding it. The restaurant breathed with its usual rhythm. Glasses touched. Silverware clinked softly against porcelain. Conversations floated beneath the gentle piano melody. Outside, rain traced slow lines across the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Park Avenue, turning city lights into shimmering ribbons of gold. Claire carried another tray toward the service station, accepted 2 fresh entrees from the kitchen, thanked the chef with a quiet smile, and walked back toward the billionaire's table without the slightest sign of hesitation. One of the men glanced at her approaching figure and whispered another sentence in Russian, confident enough to speak a little louder this time. Careful, he joked. She might accidentally spill the steak if she has to think too hard. More laughter followed. Claire carefully placed the plates before each guest with practiced elegance. She checked that every side dish matched the correct order, adjusted one misplaced fork by less than an inch, and reached for the peppermill. For 2 long seconds, the entire table ignored her as though she were part of the furniture. Claire finished seasoning the first entree exactly as requested. Then she looked gently toward the man who had made the last joke. Her blue eyes remained calm. Her voice stayed soft. And in flawless Russian, spoken with the unmistakable rhythm and polished accent of someone educated in Moscow rather than merely taught from a textbook, she said, "I hope the steak is prepared well enough that you won't have to blame the waitress for the chef's work." Every smile disappeared before the last word left her lips. The silence that settled over the table felt heavier than the crystal glasses resting between the billionaires. Claire Bennett did not wait for applause, nor did she search their faces for satisfaction. She simply offered the same courteous smile she gave every customer, placed the peppermill neatly back onto the serving tray, and asked in clear English, "Is there anything else I may bring you this evening?" None of the 4 men answered immediately. Their confidence had not disappeared, but it had shifted into something unfamiliar. Curiosity. Claire inclined her head politely before turning away with the quiet grace of someone who had already moved on. She walked toward the kitchen at the same steady pace, neither faster nor slower than before, leaving behind a table where no one seemed interested in their dinner anymore. Ethan Calloway watched her disappear through the swinging doors and lowered the tablet that had held his attention all evening. He had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions across 3 continents. He had learned to recognize intelligence long before it introduced itself. What unsettled him was not that the waitress spoke Russian. It was the way she refused to make the moment about herself. She had not embarrassed anyone. She had not corrected them with pride. She had simply answered with dignity and continued working. Across the dining room, conversations gradually returned to normal, although a few nearby guests who had overheard the exchange exchanged puzzled glances before returning to their meals. Inside the kitchen, the atmosphere could not have been more different. Steam drifted upward from polished steel counters, while chefs called out orders with practiced rhythm. Plates moved from one station to another with almost choreographed precision. Claire placed her empty tray beside the beverage station and quietly refilled a coffee pot. "Everything all right out there?" asked Maria, the restaurant manager, without looking up from the reservation screen. Claire smiled gently. "Everything is fine." Maria nodded. She trusted Claire because she never exaggerated problems and never created them. During the 2 years Claire had worked at Ashford House, she had never once raised her voice at a customer, never complained about a difficult table, and never accepted praise as though it belonged only to her. If another server needed help carrying heavy trays, Claire was already there before anyone asked. If a new employee forgot the wine list, Claire quietly slipped a handwritten study guide into the locker before the next shift. She had become the kind of person everyone depended on without realizing how often they did. 5 minutes later, she stepped back onto the dining room floor, carrying fresh coffee for another section. As she passed Ethan's table, he noticed something that surprised him even more than her flawless Russian. The small notebook tucked beside her order pad had dozens of tiny handwritten notes filling every margin. Between table numbers and meal requests were unfamiliar words written in different alphabets, each followed by careful English translations and pronunciation marks. Claire glanced down at the page for only a second while waiting for the coffee machine to finish brewing before slipping the notebook back into her apron pocket. Ethan found himself wondering how many evenings had ended with that notebook instead of television, parties, or sleep. Claire continued serving guests with the same quiet attention she gave everyone. She remembered anniversaries, noticed when an elderly guest needed extra time to choose a meal, and instinctively replaced a child's spilled napkin before his parents even looked embarrassed. None of those gestures earned applause. They simply made the room feel warmer. Near the entrance, an elderly doorman greeted a gray-haired couple struggling with umbrellas against the rain. Claire immediately walked over, accepted their wet coats, and gently offered warm towels without being asked. The couple thanked her with grateful smiles that looked entirely different from the expensive compliments money usually purchased. Ethan watched every small interaction. The Russian had impressed him. These ordinary moments interested him even more. Extraordinary skills could be learned. Quiet kindness practiced every day was far more difficult to fake. The evening continued as though nothing remarkable had happened, yet the atmosphere inside Ashford House had changed in ways that could not be measured by conversation alone. The laughter from the corner booth never fully returned. Instead, the 4 billionaires spoke more quietly, choosing their words with greater care even when they switched back to English. Claire Bennett noticed the change without acknowledging it. She continued moving through the dining room with the same calm rhythm that had carried her through hundreds of shifts before this one. She greeted every guest with equal warmth, whether they ordered a $12 dessert or a $500 bottle of wine. She thanked the busboy who cleared her tables, smiled at the hostess welcoming new reservations, and paused long enough to ask one of the pastry chefs whether his daughter had recovered from the flu. Small conversations, ordinary moments, the kind that disappeared almost as soon as they happened, yet somehow made difficult days feel lighter. Ethan Calloway found himself paying less attention to the financial projections waiting on his tablet and more attention to the woman who seemed completely unaware that she had become the most interesting person in the room. She never checked to see whether anyone was watching. She never repeated what had happened at the Billionaires table to impress another employee. She simply worked. That quiet confidence unsettled him because it reminded him of something he had not seen in years. People who truly understood their own worth rarely felt the need to announce it. As another course was served, one of the billionaires finally broke the silence. "Excuse me, Miss Bennet." Claire turned immediately. "Yes, sir." The man hesitated for a brief moment before speaking. "May I ask where you learned Russian?" It was not the demanding tone he had used earlier. It sounded almost respectful. Claire folded her hands neatly in front of her apron. "I have always enjoyed learning languages." The answer was simple, polite, and completely incomplete. "Did you study overseas?" Another guest asked with genuine curiosity. Claire smiled. Softly, "I studied wherever I could." Before anyone could ask another question, she noticed an elderly gentleman across the room struggling to read the dessert menu beneath the dim lighting. "Please excuse me," she said kindly. "Someone else needs me." She walked away before the conversation could become an interview. Ethan watched the exchange with growing fascination. She had answered every question honestly while revealing almost nothing about herself. That required a kind of discipline rarely found in boardrooms where everyone competed to appear impressive. Near the front windows, rain continued falling across Manhattan, washing reflections of yellow taxi lights into long ribbons stretching across the wet pavement. Inside, the restaurant remained warm with candlelight and quiet piano music drifting gently through the air. Claire approached the elderly guest, adjusted the small reading lamp beside his table, and patiently described each dessert without rushing him. The gentleman smiled with obvious relief. When he finally chose the apple tart, Claire congratulated him as though he had selected the perfect gift for someone he loved. Ethan noticed the man's shoulders relax. It was such a small gesture, yet it transformed the entire interaction. Money could purchase extraordinary service. Genuine attention was much harder to find. Back at the billionaires' table, conversation slowly returned, although it no longer centered on market forecasts or private investments. Instead, they found themselves wondering about the quiet waitress who had politely dismantled every assumption they had made within a single sentence. One suggested she must have been a translator before changing careers. Another guessed she had grown up overseas. The oldest among them simply stirred his coffee and shook his head. "No," he said thoughtfully. "People like her are never trying to prove they are extraordinary. That is usually how you recognize them." Ethan heard those words as Claire passed by carrying another tray toward the kitchen. She never looked in their direction. Her attention remained fixed on balancing warm soup bowls with steady hands while making sure nothing spilled onto the polished white tablecloth beneath them. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, something quieter had begun to change. It was not Claire Bennet. It was the people who had finally started seeing her. Claire Bennet carried the final dinner plates away, just as the first wave of evening reservations began to slow. The soft piano melody drifted through the dining room, while candlelight reflected against polished glass, giving the restaurant the peaceful rhythm that always arrived before dessert service. Outside, the rain had become gentler, leaving Manhattan wrapped in shimmering reflections that stretched across the sidewalks like ribbons of liquid gold. Ashford House felt warm, welcoming, and almost untouched by the restless city beyond its windows. Claire paused briefly at the service station to organize fresh silverware before noticing a distinguished older gentleman entering through the front doors. His charcoal overcoat was neatly pressed despite the weather, and his silver hair framed a face marked more by kindness than age. The hostess welcomed him with a smile before leading him toward a quiet table near the fireplace. Claire immediately recognized the subtle hesitation in his movements. It was not uncertainty. It was the familiar caution of someone navigating a country that still felt foreign despite years of visiting. She approached with the same calm smile she offered every guest. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to Ashford House." The gentleman smiled warmly, but answered in careful English that carried a thick Russian accent. "Good evening. Thank you very much." As Claire poured his water, she noticed him quietly studying the menu, lingering over several unfamiliar words. Without drawing attention to the moment, she gently switched into fluent Russian. "If you would like, I can explain today's specialties in your native language." The gentleman slowly lowered the menu and looked at her with unmistakable surprise. His expression softened almost immediately into genuine relief. "You speak beautifully," he replied in Russian. "It has been several weeks since anyone has greeted me like I was back home." Claire smiled modestly. Everyone deserves to feel understood while sharing a meal. The gentleman laughed quietly, not with surprise, but with appreciation. Their conversation remained brief and respectful as Claire carefully explained the chef's recommendations, the seasonal ingredients, and a traditional soup that reminded him of recipes from his childhood. Nothing about the exchange was dramatic. No one raised their voice. No one applauded. Yet several nearby diners noticed the older man's face brighten in a way that expensive restaurants rarely inspired. Across the dining room, Ethan Calloway had been preparing to leave after settling his bill, but something about the elderly guest's expression caused him to remain seated. He watched as Claire listened more than she spoke, allowing the gentleman to tell a short story about visiting New York with his late wife many years earlier. She never interrupted. She never rushed him toward ordering. She simply gave him the rare gift of feeling heard. Even the four billionaires found themselves quietly observing from across the room. Earlier, they had been impressed by Claire's flawless pronunciation. Now they witnessed something entirely different. She was not demonstrating linguistic talent. She was offering comfort. There was no audience to impress, no business deal to influence, and no advantage to gain. The language existed only to make another human being feel less alone. The oldest billionaire slowly placed his coffee cup onto its saucer and whispered almost to himself. "We thought the words were the remarkable part. They were never the point." Ethan heard him clearly. For the first time that evening, he realized why Claire's response at their table had felt so different from every display of intelligence he had encountered in boardrooms around the world. Most brilliant people used knowledge to prove they were right. Claire used knowledge to help someone else feel welcome. Minutes later, she returned carrying the gentleman's dinner with careful hands, placing each plate exactly where it belonged before quietly wishing him an enjoyable meal in Russian. The elderly man thanked her with eyes that reflected quiet gratitude rather than surprise. Ethan looked down at the untouched espresso cooling beside him. Somewhere between the first laugh he had overheard earlier that evening and the quiet conversation now unfolding across the room, the meaning of success had begun to feel different. Wealth could purchase almost any luxury imaginable, but it could never buy the feeling of being understood by a stranger who expected nothing in return. The older gentleman finished his meal slowly, savoring every bite with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found more than good food during an ordinary evening. Before leaving, he thanked Claire once again in Russian, and she wished him safe travels with the same gentle warmth she had shown from the beginning. There was no dramatic farewell, no exchange of business cards, only a sincere smile shared between two strangers who had briefly made each other's day better. As the front door closed behind him, the dining room settled back into its familiar rhythm, but Ethan Calloway remained seated, his untouched espresso now completely cold. He had attended international conferences where executives proudly displayed fluency in several languages as though each one were another trophy. Yet none of those moments felt as meaningful as what he had just witnessed. Claire had not spoken Russian to impress anyone. She had spoken it because someone needed to feel at home. That difference stayed with him. He watched as Claire quietly collected empty dessert plates from another table before kneeling beside a young family whose little boy looked disappointed after dropping his scoop of vanilla ice cream onto the tablecloth. Instead of calling attention to the accident, Claire smiled and whispered, "I think every great dessert deserves a second chance." The little boy laughed. Within moments, a fresh bowl arrived from the kitchen without charge. His parents looked relieved rather than embarrassed. Claire simply wished them a wonderful evening and continued on her way. She left behind another ordinary moment that would probably become one of the family's favorite memories without ever knowing it. Ethan finally stood and walked toward the reception desk where Maria was reviewing reservations for the following evening. "May I ask you something?" he said politely. Maria smiled. "Of course, Mr. Calloway." Ethan glanced across the dining room, where Claire was carefully folding clean linen napkins. "How long has Claire worked here?" "Just over 2 years," Maria replied. "Has she always spoken Russian?" Maria laughed softly. "She has always surprised people, but not because she tries to. Every few months someone discovers another language she speaks or another guest she quietly helped. Then everyone acts shocked while Claire goes right back to work." Ethan looked genuinely puzzled. "How many languages does she know?" Maria shrugged with an amused smile. "Honestly, I stopped counting after 6. She never talks about them unless a guest needs her." Ethan turned back toward Claire. She was now helping one of the newer servers memorize the proper order for formal table settings. She corrected a misplaced fork with patient encouragement instead of criticism, then thanked the young server for working so hard. The conversation lasted less than a minute, yet the nervous employee walked away noticeably more confident. "Why is she still working here?" Ethan asked quietly, almost to himself. Maria did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched Claire refill sugar bowls near the coffee station before speaking in a thoughtful voice. "Some people stay because they cannot leave. Claire stays because she believes every job deserves dignity. She says the way we treat people should never depend on what they do for a living." Those words settled into Ethan's thoughts with unexpected weight. Throughout his career, he had evaluated thousands of resumes, interviewed brilliant graduates from prestigious universities, and hired consultants whose hourly fees exceeded what many families earned in a week. Yet he could not remember the last time someone had impressed him simply by treating every person with equal respect. As he reached for his coat, the 4 billionaires also prepared to leave. The oldest among them approached Claire before walking toward the exit. He paused for a moment, his expression carrying none of the confidence he had worn earlier that evening. "Miss Bennett," he said sincerely, "thank you for reminding us that education is not something a person wears." Claire smiled with quiet humility. "Thank you, sir. I hope you all enjoyed your dinner." There was no trace of victory in her voice. She accepted the compliment as naturally as she accepted every order, every request, and every ordinary responsibility that came with her shift. Ethan watched the exchange from across the room, realizing that the greatest lesson of the evening had never come from perfect pronunciation or remarkable intelligence. It had come from a woman who understood that true knowledge becomes meaningful only when it is used to make someone else's world a little kinder. The dinner rush gradually faded into the quieter rhythm that always settled over Ashford House after 9 o'clock. Candle flames flickered gently against polished glass while the pianist shifted into slower melodies that blended with the muted conversations of the remaining guests. Claire Bennett carried a tray of empty coffee cups toward the kitchen, exchanged a cheerful thank you with the dishwasher, and returned moments later with freshly folded linen napkins balanced neatly in her arms. The restaurant had become almost peaceful, the kind of calm that rewarded people who appreciated small moments instead of constant excitement. Ethan Calloway had already paid his bill, yet he found himself standing near the entrance instead of walking into the rainy Manhattan night. For reasons he could not completely explain, he wanted to understand the woman whose quiet presence had changed the atmosphere of an entire dining room without ever demanding attention. As Claire passed nearby with another tray, Ethan stepped aside so she could move comfortably through the narrow aisle. "Miss Bennett," he said with genuine courtesy. Claire stopped and offered the same professional smile she had given every guest throughout the evening. "Good evening, Mr. Calloway. Is there anything else I can help you with?" Ethan hesitated for a brief moment. Negotiating billion-dollar agreements had never made him nervous, yet asking a simple question suddenly required more thought than expected. "May I ask you something? That has nothing to do with the menu." Claire nodded politely. "If I can answer it." Ethan glanced toward the windows where rain continued, tracing gentle patterns across the glass. "Earlier tonight, when those gentlemen spoke Russian, you could have embarrassed them. No one would have blamed you. Instead, you corrected a single sentence and continued serving dinner as though nothing had happened." "What?" Claire considered the question quietly before answering. "Because people usually remember how you make them feel longer than they remember what you say." Ethan listened without interrupting. Claire continued in the same calm voice. "If I had tried to embarrass them, they probably would have remembered my words. I hoped they would remember something better." Ethan looked at her thoughtfully. "Respect." Claire smiled softly. "Perspective." The answer lingered between them. She adjusted the folded napkins resting against her arm before speaking again. "Sometimes people make unfair assumptions because they have never been given a reason to think differently. Becoming angry rarely changes that. Giving them a different experience sometimes does." Ethan lowered his eyes for a second, absorbing every word. During his years in business, he had seen countless presentations about leadership, communication, and emotional intelligence. None of them had explained human nature as simply or as honestly as the waitress standing before him. Before he could respond, a young busboy hurried past carrying a stack of clean glasses. One slipped slightly from the tray, and Claire instinctively steadied it with her free hand before it could fall. The young employee looked embarrassed. "I am so sorry." Claire smiled reassuringly. "You are learning. That is more important than being perfect." The young man thanked her and continued toward the dining room with noticeably greater confidence. Ethan watched the exchange in silence. It seemed that every conversation Claire had somehow left another person feeling lighter than before. "You encourage everyone," Ethan observed quietly. Claire looked genuinely surprised by the comment. "Most people are trying harder than we realize," she replied. "Hey, little encouragement usually costs less than criticism." Those words settled into Ethan's thoughts with unexpected force. He remembered countless meetings where pressure had replaced patience and competition had replaced kindness. Success had always been measured by quarterly numbers, market growth, and strategic victories. Standing inside the warm glow of Ashford House, those measurements suddenly felt incomplete. Claire glanced toward the kitchen as the chef rang a small service bell announcing another dessert order. "I should get back to work." Ethan nodded respectfully. "Thank you for answering my question." Claire offered one final smile. "Thank you for asking it." She turned and walked calmly toward the service station, disappearing once again into the familiar rhythm of her evening. Ethan remained where he stood, watching her quietly help another table before disappearing behind the kitchen doors. For the first time in many years, he realized that the wisest lesson he had learned all month had not come from an executive conference, an investment report, or a board meeting. It had come from an ordinary conversation with a waitress who never once tried to prove she was extraordinary. Closing time arrived one table at a time. The dining room gradually emptied until only a handful of late guests remained beneath the warm amber lights that had glowed steadily since sunset. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets of Manhattan washed clean beneath reflections of traffic lights and office windows. Claire Bennett quietly polished the final row of wine glasses before carrying them back to their shelves with the same careful attention she had given every task throughout the evening. Ethan Calloway had stepped outside once, intending to leave, yet after reaching the sidewalk he found himself turning back. Something about the conversations of the night continued following him more closely than the cool spring air. When he re-entered the restaurant, Maria was reviewing the next day's reservation list while several employees prepared to finish their shifts. Claire had already removed her apron and folded it neatly beside her locker before slipping on. A simple gray coat that looked several years old but carefully maintained. She thanked every coworker individually before preparing to leave. Ethan approached Maria quietly. "May I ask one last question?" Maria smiled knowingly. "I wondered if you might." Ethan looked toward Claire, who was helping one of the newer servers zip a heavy winter jacket before sending her home, with a gentle reminder to drive carefully. "Earlier you said she believes every job deserves dignity. Where did she learn to see people that way?" Maria remained silent for a moment before answering. "Life taught her." Ethan waited patiently. Claire earned a scholarship several years ago. She studied languages at one of the best universities in the country. Her professors believed she would eventually work in diplomacy or international business. Ethan looked genuinely surprised, although somehow the information confirmed everything he had already sensed. "What happened?" Maria glanced toward the front entrance where Claire was now thanking the elderly doorman for another evening of opening umbrellas for guests. Her father became seriously ill during her junior year. Memory problems at first. Then it became something much harder. Medical appointments. Daily care. Eventually, someone had to choose between finishing school and staying home. Ethan already knew the answer before Maria spoke again. Claire chose her father. The words settled heavily into the quiet restaurant. "She told me once that degrees can sometimes wait. People cannot." Ethan lowered his eyes thoughtfully. "Did she ever return?" Maria gently shook her head. "She has taken online classes whenever she could, but caring for family while working full-time leaves very little room for personal dreams. She never complains about it. In fact, most people here do not even know." Ethan watched Claire laugh softly as the dishwasher handed her a paper bag containing leftover bread the kitchen would otherwise throw away. She thanked him as though he had given her something priceless. Nothing about her suggested disappointment or regret. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who measured success differently from the rest of the world. A few moments later, Claire stepped outside into the cool evening. Instead of walking toward a luxury car or calling for a private ride, she crossed the street to a city bus stop, adjusted the strap of her worn canvas bag, and quietly opened the small notebook Ethan had noticed earlier. Even while waiting for public transportation after a 10-hour shift, she spent the next several minutes reviewing handwritten vocabulary in another language, softly practicing unfamiliar pronunciations beneath her breath. Learning had never left her life. It had simply changed locations. Ethan stood inside the restaurant watching through the glass, without saying a word. The city bus arrived with a gentle hiss of air brakes. Claire climbed aboard, greeted the driver by name, thanked him, and disappeared into the softly lit cabin as the bus pulled away from the curb. Ethan remained motionless for several more seconds before looking down at the business card still resting in his hand. Every instinct developed through years of corporate leadership told him he had just met someone his company would eagerly recruit. Yet another thought quietly replaced it. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Claire Bennett was not that she spoke several languages or possessed extraordinary intelligence. It was that despite every sacrifice life had asked of her, she had never allowed hardship to make her unkind. And somehow, that seemed far rarer than fluency in any language. The following Tuesday arrived with bright spring sunshine spilling between the glass towers of Midtown Manhattan, making the city feel lighter than it had only a few days before. Inside the headquarters of Callaway Strategic Capital, Ethan Callaway stood beside the conference room windows watching employees prepare for one of the company's most important meetings of the quarter. A delegation from Eastern Europe was arriving to discuss a long-term partnership involving manufacturing investments, technology licensing, and regional expansion. Months of preparation had led to this single afternoon. Every presentation had been reviewed repeatedly. Every financial projection had been verified. Every cultural briefing had been distributed to the executive team. Yet as Ethan studied the agenda one final time, he found himself remembering an entirely different conversation that had taken place beside a restaurant aisle instead of a conference table. Shortly before noon, the visitors arrived precisely on schedule. Their leader was Viktor Sokolov, a respected businessman known not only for his financial expertise, but also for his deep appreciation of tradition, history, and personal relationships. The opening introductions proceeded smoothly until one of Ethan's senior executives attempted to welcome the guests by using a memorized Russian greeting. The pronunciation was understandable, but several subtle mistakes changed both the rhythm and the meaning. No one appeared offended. Victor simply smiled politely before continuing the meeting in English. Still, Ethan noticed something familiar in the older man's expression. It reminded him of the gentleman at Ashford House, whose face had brightened the moment someone spoke to him naturally instead of mechanically. The meeting continued for nearly an hour. Financial models appeared on large presentation screens. Market forecasts were discussed. Risk assessments were carefully explained. Everything remained professional, yet something invisible seemed to be missing. During a short coffee break, Victor wandered toward a display of photographs celebrating the company's international projects. He paused before an image of employees volunteering at a neighborhood food bank and smiled quietly. "Interesting," he said. "Your company values community." Ethan nodded. "We try to." Victor looked thoughtfully at the photograph before replying. "Many companies speak about values. Fewer live them." Those words echoed with surprising familiarity. Ethan suddenly remembered Claire saying that people remembered how someone made them feel far longer than what they said. The similarity was impossible to ignore. Instead of returning immediately to spreadsheets and negotiations, Ethan chose a different direction. "May I ask you something, Mr. Sokolov?" Victor smiled warmly. "Of course." Ethan hesitated only briefly. "When you travel, what makes you trust someone?" Victor answered almost immediately. "Respect before business." Ethan remained silent. Victor continued in his calm voice. "When someone tries too hard to impress me, I become cautious. When someone genuinely wishes to understand me, I begin listening." Ethan smiled to himself. The lesson sounded remarkably similar to one he had already received from a waitress carrying coffee instead of corporate titles. The afternoon meeting resumed with a noticeably different tone. Ethan set aside several prepared talking points and invited the delegation to share stories about the communities where their employees lived. The conversation gradually shifted from contracts toward families, education, traditions, and the people behind the numbers. Laughter appeared naturally. Small misunderstandings disappeared before becoming problems. By the end of the meeting, both sides had agreed to continue working together, but Ethan understood that the strongest foundation had not been built by financial strategy alone. As the visitors prepared to leave, Victor shook Ethan's hand warmly. "Your company has excellent professionals," he said. "But today I also met good people. That matters more than many executives realize." After the conference room emptied, Ethan remained alone for several minutes, looking across the Manhattan skyline stretching beyond the windows. He reached into his jacket pocket and found the business card he had almost handed Claire several nights earlier. He had originally imagined offering her a position based on impressive language skills. Now he realized that would have missed the point entirely. Her greatest qualification had never been fluency. It had been character. She had taught him that language was only a bridge. Respect was the destination. And for the first time in years, Ethan understood that the most valuable education he had received had never taken place inside a university or a boardroom. It had quietly arrived beside a restaurant table from someone who believed that every person deserved to feel seen, heard, and understood. Several weeks passed, and life quietly returned to its familiar rhythm. Every evening, the lights inside Ashford House glowed warmly against the Manhattan skyline while guests celebrated anniversaries, business victories, birthdays, and ordinary Tuesdays that slowly became cherished memories. Claire Bennett continued greeting every customer with the same gentle smile, never mentioning the evening when a few unexpected words had changed the way an entire dining room viewed the woman carrying their coffee. To her, it had simply been another shift, another opportunity to treat people well. One rainy Thursday, as she finished arranging fresh flowers near the entrance before dinner service, Maria walked toward her, holding a small envelope. "Someone stopped by earlier and asked me to give this to you," she said. Claire accepted it with quiet curiosity. There was no company logo on the cream-colored envelope, only her name, written neatly in blue ink. She opened it carefully and unfolded a single handwritten note. It read, "Thank you for reminding me that leadership begins with listening, respect begins with humility, and knowledge means very little unless it makes another person's life better. You changed more than one conversation that evening. You changed the way I see people. Wishing you and your father every blessing. Ethan Calloway." Nothing else was included. No business proposal. No invitation. No check. No request. Only gratitude. Claire read the note once more before folding it carefully and placing it inside the small notebook she carried every day. She smiled to herself and quietly returned to polishing the silverware for the evening service. Across town, Ethan stood before a new group of young managers attending their first leadership workshop at Callaway Strategic Capital. Instead of beginning with quarterly earnings or market forecasts, he surprised everyone by asking a simple question. When someone walks into your office, what do they hope to feel before they hear your first decision? The room remained silent. Ethan smiled because several weeks earlier he would not have known the answer either. "They hope to feel respected," he said softly. "Never forget that titles describe responsibility. They do not measure human worth." His employees listened carefully. Some wrote down every word. Others simply nodded. None of them knew that the lesson had been learned from a waitress whose name would never appear in a business textbook. Later that evening, one of the 4 billionaires from the restaurant returned to Ashford House with his wife to celebrate their wedding anniversary. When Claire greeted them, he stood before sitting down and offered a warm handshake instead of a casual nod. "It is good to see you again, Miss Bennett," he said sincerely. "Likewise, sir," Claire replied with the same calm kindness she had always shown. During dinner, he thanked every member of the staff by name whenever possible, complimented the young servers learning their craft, and left the restaurant with a quiet appreciation that had not been part of him before that unforgettable evening. Sometimes change announced itself with headlines. Sometimes it arrived with a softer voice. As Claire stepped outside after another long shift, the city air felt fresh after a light spring rain. She walked toward the familiar bus stop carrying her worn canvas bag, her language notebook, and the handwritten letters safely tucked inside its pages. The same bus driver smiled as she climbed aboard. "Long day?" he asked. Claire returned the smile. "A good one." She found her usual seat beside the window as the bus rolled through streets glowing beneath reflected lights. People hurried home carrying briefcases, grocery bags, umbrellas, and dreams no one else could see. Claire watched them quietly, wondering what languages they spoke, what burdens they carried, and what kindness might still be waiting for each of them before the night was over. The city continued moving forward, unaware that one ordinary waitress had reminded a handful of powerful people of something they had almost forgotten. Intelligence earns admiration. Wealth earns attention. But quiet dignity earns trust. And in the end, the people who leave the deepest mark on the world are often the ones who never raise their voices, only the standard by which they treat everyone they meet.